Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DVS Group Research. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 107th episode. We've been doing this podcast for well over 3 years, and during this period, no episode has garnered as much attention as episode 52, the one we had with Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. Mr. Mahbubani has been privileged to enjoy two distinguished careers, two distinct and distinguished ones, in diplomacy, which started way back in 1971 all the way to 2004, and in academia from 2004 to 2019. He remains a prolific writer, having published 8 well-received books, and he's also a very well-covered speaker. You can catch many of his landmark speeches on the internet. Kishore Mahbubani, a warm welcome back to Kopi Time.
My pleasure.
It's great.
Happy to be with you.
It's great to have you as well. I wish we were doing this in person with a warm cup of Kopi, but I think this will have to do today. I'm going to start by playing back something you said at the beginning of your previous appearance on Kopi Time. For context, this was back in April 2021. You had just published an op-ed on FT about the Biden administration's approach toward China.
I want to emphasize that I want Biden to succeed. My nightmare is that in 2024, we will see the return of Donald Trump. And I'm not even exaggerating, because at the end of the day, he did get 75 million votes. And if Biden gets it wrong, the world is in trouble. So our interest, including in Singapore and in Southeast Asia, is to help Biden succeed. By carrying on with Trump's policies on China, when they clearly have failed in every sense of the term. And, as I explained in my book, As China Won, the fundamental problem about the contest that Donald Trump launched against China is that he launched this contest without a strategy.
Okay, no strategy, and you want Biden to succeed. It's been 2.5 years since that conversation. What's your take?
Well, unfortunately, my nightmare might come true. The possibility of Donald Trump being elected is not zero. In fact, it could be as high as 30 or 40%. Some of the surveys show that his standing in the polls is the same as Joe Biden. I mean, it's unfair because Joe Biden overall hasn't done a bad job. And he's kept the economy going and done many right things, tried to stabilize the US-China relationship in some ways. But sadly, the chances of him losing are not, again, as I said, not zero. So we are going to go through in the next, let's say, this is now September 2023, the elections are November 2024. I guarantee you a roller coaster ride in terms of American politics. Lots of surprising things are happening. I mean, I'll give you one of the most remarkable things about the American political scene today. A majority of Republicans don't want Donald Trump to be the candidate. But what's the likelihood? Donald Trump will be the candidate. Now, a majority of Democrats don't want Joe Biden to be the candidate. What's going to be the outcome? Joe Biden's going to be the candidate. So these are the kind of strange things that are happening in the American political scene. So we have to be ready, for some real shocks and surprises over the next 14 months.
And when you say shocks and surprises, you mean not only in the context of the US politics, but is repercussion then feeding into US foreign policy?
Absolutely. Sadly, one way for American presidents to win elections is to beat up on other countries. So let me just give you a simple example. 31 years ago, when Bill Clinton was running for the presidency, what did he do? He, in his campaign, said, unlike George H.W. Bush, I will not coddle the butchers of Beijing. So he used China as a way of attacking George H.W. Bush, and he won. But fortunately, he did go on to coddle the leaders of Beijing, incidentally.
Yes.
But that was a different time. Now, I am confident that China will still be a factor in the 2024 elections. There's no doubt that Donald Trump will accuse Joe Biden of being soft on China, and the Biden administration will have to prove that it's not soft on China by taking more measures against China. So China will become the biggest political football in the 2024 election.
You said earlier when you were assessing the Biden presidency that it has done a constructive job in stabilizing the China-US relationship. I'm struck by that because I think about the headlines accumulated over the last couple of years. I see almost one-way street in terms of more and more export restrictions from the US and more support for Taiwan and so on. So what are the parameters that you're looking at when you say that they have actually done a commendable job in stabilizing the relationship?
Well, I would say the one good thing that the Biden administration done is to resume normal communications with China. So as you know, in this year, 2023, Blinken has gone to China. Janet Yellen has gone to China. Most recently, Gina Raimondo has gone to China. So at least he's tried to keep the dialogue going. But of course, this doesn't mean, by the way, that the whole US campaign to stop China from becoming number one has stopped. It hasn't. Because there's something that's beyond Trump and Biden. And that is that within the American establishment, there is a remarkable consensus that the US has about 10 years to stop China from becoming number one. And, that's what my book, Has China Won, is about. That there is an incredible focused determination now on the part of the American establishment to use the next 10 years to stop China, because they know that once China becomes number one, and it can become number one, then everything changes in the world. So regardless of whether or not Trump wins or Biden wins or Vivek Ramaswamy wins or Kamala Harris wins, it doesn't matter. And it comes to this geopolitical contest between US and China, it goes beyond personalities. And this is something that I've been predicting for a long time. And nothing has changed the course of this.
But Kishore, in the podcast that we had 2 years ago, your assertion was that the Trump administration did not have a strategy vis-a-vis China. They were going a bit helter-skelter. But it seems to me that now you're painting a picture where there is a bipartisan consensus and there is a pretty cohesive strategic view of how to counter China.
There is a bipartisan consensus to counter China, but there is still no strategy. And what the sadly, and I say this as a friend of the United States, the United States is carrying out ad hoc action after ad hoc action without having a clear strategy on how you're going to stop China. So, for example, take the trade tariffs that Trump administration put against China, right? Now, if you ask any sensible economist, which, by the way, would include people like Janet Yellen, will these trade tariffs hurt China more or hurt the American consumers more? And the simple answer is going to hurt the American consumers more. In fact, Joe Biden said so in his election campaign. But has the Biden administration been able to lift the trade sanctions on China? No way. No way. See, that reflects a lack of strategy. And similarly, all these acts to stop China's technological development, denying them the most advanced chips, there's a long history of countries trying to stop China's technological development. And it has never succeeded. I mean, I'll give you a simple example. The Soviet Union thought that they could remain much stronger than China by depriving China of access to nuclear weapon technology. Guess what? Within a couple of years, the Chinese had it. Right? So, there have been obvious. China is now producing more STEM graduates, I suspect, than the rest of the world combined in some ways, And the idea that you can stop China from becoming a scientific power is absurd. The Americans refuse to collaborate with China in the space program. Look at what China has done, build its own space station. So it is actually, this is where the fundamental problem with people in the American administration is that they don't have a long-term mindset. They don't realize that the Chinese are looking to see where they're going to be, where the world is going to be 10 years, 20 years down the road. And you ask the Biden administration people, they are so focused on the November 2024 election, they can't look beyond that. And so that actually puts the US as a strategic disadvantage vis-a-vis China. It doesn't mean, by the way, that the US can't do significant damage or temporary damage to the Chinese economy. It can. We'll try. Will that stop China's growth? I don't think it will.
It is remarkable that this issue about technological supremacy is become such a focus and obsession of the media. I'm sure you've seen in the last few days rather hysterical coverage in Western media about Huawei's sort of return to the smartphone scene with a new phone, and everybody's questioning how on earth did they get the chips or the know-how to do it, because Huawei was supposed to be on a terminal decline after the Trump administration's bans a few years ago. So I think that adds to your point that not only on nuclear technology or space technology, even the one that is absolutely critical now, the chip technology and the frontier of electronics, it's not like they will be fully strangled. Damage will be done, no question, but that may be just a manifestation of slowing down as opposed to stopping them forever.
By the way, you're right. You're right to mention this Huawei case. I must say, I'm really surprised too. I thought, I by the way, I actually conducted a dialogue once with the founder of Huawei, Mr. Ren, on Bloomberg TV, and I was very impressed by him. He's very dedicated, and what the Americans underestimate is the determination of the Chinese people. And the Americans also don't understand that when they carry out actions against Huawei, they're pouring salt into open Chinese wounds. And these open Chinese wounds come from the century of humiliation that China suffered from 1842 to 1949. And when you carry out actions like Huawei, they say, there goes the West once again. They want to beat up China. They want to slap China down. But this time, they cannot succeed. So, the national determination in China is absolutely amazing. And so I wish that the Americans leaders who make a bigger effort to studying Chinese history, and by the way, I have a free edX course for them that they can enroll in, and they will see that they got to step into the shoes of the Chinese leaders and understand that the Chinese cannot allow China to go backwards again.
But sure, I've seen people draw parallels between U.S. restrictions on Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, 80s on area of technology. And as a result, the view is that the Soviets actually did have a huge gap with respect to frontier technology, notwithstanding their success in the space program. And the view is that this is going to be something that can be replicated in the context of China, that if you have very strong trade barriers for China to access frontier technology, it will not be able to develop on its own. Is your view that China will also have a bit of a Sputnik moment that the Americans had after Sputnik's successful launch, and they would rather starve than miss out on the frontier technologies?
Well, I'm actually very, very glad that you're bringing up this historical analogy, because if indeed the Biden administration or the US government is using the old playbook against the Soviet Union and saying, we can use the same playbook succeeded with the Soviet Union against China, then they're getting it dead wrong. Because the Soviet Union, in many ways, had self-isolated. It didn't trade with the rest of the world. Its economy wasn't engaged with the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union was not the access to advanced technology. It was the fact that their economy couldn't compete with the American economy, just couldn't grow as fast. And was stagnant, couldn't produce the consumer goods and so on and so forth. And certainly could not manufacture more than the United States of America. Now, let me ask you a simple question. Who has a larger manufacturing capability today? Is it the United States or is it the China? Now, let me ask you a second question. Who does more trade with the rest of the world? In the old days, clearly United States over the Soviet Union. Today is China over the United States of America. Then let me ask you a third question. Between the United States and Soviet Union, which country was willing to sign free trade agreements in the Cold War? It was the United States, not the Soviet Union. Today, it is China and not the United States. So these are amazing differences. And if there's one country that has studied the collapse of the Soviet Union more than any other country in the world, it is China. And what's the first lesson that the Chinese took from the collapse of the Soviet Union? Never close up your economy. Always engage with the rest of the world. And it's sort of bizarre that in some ways, it is the United States that's behaving more like the Soviet Union, for example, by refusing to sign free trade agreements, than China does. But having said that, let me emphasize that the United States still remains a formidable economic power, a formidable political power, a formidable intellectual power in terms of soft power and so on and so forth. So it'd be a huge mistake for China to underestimate the United States of America.
I want to switch gear a little bit and talk about the conflict of the moment, the war in Ukraine. In sequence, what is China's strategy vis-a-vis the Russians, and what is America's endgame vis-a-vis the Russians?
Well, let me begin by saying that in the long run, the Ukraine conflict will be seen as a sideshow. That's not a real contest. And in some ways, the United States is doing itself a disfavor by dragging out this Ukraine conflict. And I say the United States is dragging out the Ukraine conflict because without American support for Ukraine, the war wouldn't last as long as it has. And it is not going to be the fundamental mover of world history. It's going to be a major distraction. But this war could have been avoided. And all you have to do is watch the video of John Mearsheimer, which has now been watched 40 million times, over 40 million times. And you get a sense that in some ways, if the Europeans had been wiser and worked out ways and means of integrating Russia into not the European Union, but into the European community, create a common European house, as Gorbachev said, then this war could have been avoided. What this war shows more than anything else is the geopolitical incompetence of Europe. And yeah, it's a tragedy because if Europe had had a more independent policy and found ways and means of accommodating Russian concerns without kowtowing to Russia, by the way. You don't have to kowtow to Russia, but you can give it the space and find a compromise solution on Ukraine. This war future historians will record that this war could have been avoided. But unfortunately, Europe no longer has a sort of strong, powerful leaders like Margaret Thatcher, like Francois Mitterrand, like Helmut Kohl, like Helmut Schmidt, No longer has that. And so that's why this war is dragging on. And by the way, one clear factor in this war is that Putin is definitely not going to do anything until November 2024. Because if Trump wins, then Putin wins.
On the Chinese side of the dynamic?
Well, the Chinese are very, very unhappy about this Ukraine war. If they had a choice, they would rather that Putin didn't start this invasion of Ukraine, because it's in the long-term strategic interests of China to see Europe emerge as an independent political pole that the China can deal with as an autonomous geopolitical actor. But as a result of the Ukraine war, the Europeans have become far more dependent on Americans for their protection, certainly against Russia. And they have become, in some ways, geopolitically compliant to American wishes. And if you want proof of this, just take a look at the case of Italy. Right? Italy was the only G7 country that was brave enough to have an independent foreign policy and join the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, the Italian government is under so much pressure from Washington, D.C., that it feels that it has to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, even though it's in Italy's national interests to stay in the BRI, because if Italy loses special access to the Chinese market, it will be very bad for the Italian economy. The Italian economy has stopped growing, as we all know. It needs a new impetus for growth. And the new impetus for growth is not going to come from the US economy. It's going to come from the Chinese economy, because the new middle class, the large middle class that is going to buy Italian luxury products, is not going to come from the United States. It's going to come from China. So the Italians are, in a sense, sacrificing their own future by withdrawing from the BRI because of American pressure. But this is an example of Europe, how Europe has become geopolitically compliant to American wishes.
But Kishore, you say China is unhappy with the developments in Ukraine, but at the same time, China seems to be taking quite a bit of advantage, getting discounted energy supply from Russia. I just read about how some of the bank lending from the West that was suspended after the war began is now being sort of complemented or supplemented by Russians, by the Chinese RMB loans. So whether it is the internationalization of the currency strategy or having greater sort of secure sources of energy, from that perspective, this war is working to China's favor.
Actually, China is not the only country benefiting from cheap Russian energy supplies. I think India's imports from Russia of energy used to be 1%, and 1% has become 20%. But what's even more interesting is that India is buying cheap Russian energy, refining it, and then selling it to Europe. So Europe is actually not complying with its own sanctions against Russia. And I don't know how many Singaporeans know this. Huh? The Europeans give all kinds of exemptions to themselves when it comes to purchasing Russian energy. And if I'm not mistaken, please go and double check this. Despite the major war in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, Russian gas is still flowing through Ukrainian pipelines into Europe.
No, that's correct.
So it's amazing. They're asking the rest of the world to beat up on Russia and sanction Russia, while they quietly pocket exemptions for themselves. Now, this is double standards and hypocrisy of the highest order. And this is an example of how the standing of the European Union is going down in the world. And I can tell you, for example, Jaishankar, the foreign minister of India, made an absolutely remarkable statement when he said, Europe thinks that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but he doesn't want to believe that the world's problems are Europe's problems. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically, he's implying that Europe is being very selfish. And Europe is not even taking into consideration the fact that the Ukraine war is not just hurting Europeans. It's hurting a lot of Africans in cutting off access to food supplies and so on and so forth. And as far as the Europeans concerned, that's the African problem. Now that's again in its own way also something very cruel. It's something that the Europeans should also take into consideration, that is this war hurting not just the Ukrainians and the Russians, it's hurting the Europeans and hurting the Africans and to some extent Asians too. But of course, in other areas, as you know, the cheap Russian energy in some ways is benefiting a lot of Asian countries too, including India and China.
Right. So this conflict in Ukraine, on one hand, has underscored the huge dependence we still have on fossil fuel-based energy, and in turn, it's reinforced Europe's desire to seek energy independence by generating significant amount of renewable energy capacity. And under Biden, with the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of support is going in that direction as well. So when John Kerry was made the climate czar, one view was that at least on climate change, Europe, US, China would sit on the same table and make some tangible progress. Have you seen any hope there?
Well, sadly, I mean, this is where I would say my biggest disappointment with the Biden administration is that the Biden administration genuinely is committed to fighting climate change. Now, if you're committed to fighting climate change, you know, in life it's all about trade-offs. What's your most important priority? And frankly, we all know that the most important priority is that we don't have planet B to go to if we destroy planet Earth. So clearly, since the clock is ticking, and the only way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to cooperate with all the major economic powers. Logically, what the United States should be doing, if it was run by an intelligent, rational administration that is thinking long-term, the United States should say, hey, let's press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest. Let's focus on fighting climate change. What's the point of winning a geopolitical contest against China if you don't have a planet to enjoy it on, right? What's the point? I mean, you're number one, but number one of a planet that's gone. That's absurd, right? So clearly, the logical, rational decision for the Biden administration to take is to say, okay, climate change is my number one priority. Fighting China is not my most important priority. It should be number two. Right? So, but that kind of decision cannot be made by any administration in the United States because the anti-China consensus is ferocious. And, you know, in today's United States, if you say anything that is even slightly reasonable or rational on China, you get attacked ferociously. And therefore, nobody, not even the fiercest advocates of climate change, like John Kerry, for example, can say, hey, guys, let's focus on fighting climate change. Let's delay our actions against China. Again, this is something that's this is why I think we Asians need to speak out a lot more than we have. Because I think the silence of the Asians, I find quite sad. But just, by the way, just to balance that, since we did our last podcast, I issued my book, the new Asian 21st Century, in January 2022 as an open access free book. And my publisher they told me 20,000 downloads. Instead, there have been over 3.2 million downloads in 160 countries since January 2022. Now, I only mentioned that for one reason. Psychologically, the rest of the world is preparing for the Asian century, while the Americans are still trying to preserve the American century. And that's going to create a fundamental disconnect between America and the world. The Americans don't pay attention to long-term trends. And I actually, again, as a friend of the United States, I'm saying, hey, this is a different world that's emerging. Instead of trying to protect American primacy, focus on improving the living conditions of the American people. In the long run, the choice for any US government The fundamental strategic choice is, do you advance the interests of American primacy, or do you advance the interests of American people, who, by the way, will suffer if there's climate change? So if you are interested in protecting American people, fight climate change first. Don't fight China. But only if primacy is your number one objective, then you fight China. These are the strategic decisions that I feel very sad that American strategic thinkers are not bringing out these big fundamental dilemmas that America needs to address. Instead, everything is focused on short term, on the next election, on beating up China, with no discussion of the long-term issues.
So, because you're sitting here in Singapore, we don't even need to go to Washington, because Washington, D.C. sends all sorts of government officials and thinkers to Singapore on a regular basis. You meet them. I have had the privilege of meeting a few of them in recent years. And the phrases that we hear are very predictable: a rules-based order, guardrails around the relationship between the U.S. and China, de-risking, and that sort of terminology. So it seems like there is this whole attempt to create basically a club of the willing, of course, with the exclusion of China. So we saw a summit between the U.S., Korea, and Japan recently. We have been looking at the whole Quad-related developments for years. So all of these forums sort of conspicuously exclude China. So do you think these sort of efforts to quote-unquote de-risk actually achieve the de-risking objective, or it's actually exacerbating the situation?
Well, it's interesting. There's no doubt that the U.S. Government, I say this U.S. government because it's either Trump administration or Biden administration, still wants to try and isolate China. But again, this is where there's no long-term strategic thinking. Only 12% of the population of the world lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. And the majority of them, by the way, want to continue trading with China and want to continue dealing with China. And so, take Brazil, for example. 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. Look at that. And you're asking Brazil to isolate China? So, I mean, it is the Americans don't realize that in the Cold War, they successfully contained the Soviet Union. But today, they cannot contain China. It's a mission impossible. And, you talk of Quad and so on and so forth. Look at ASEAN, right? In the year 2000, US trade with ASEAN was $135 billion. And China's trade with ASEAN was only $40 billion. So US trade with ASEAN was more than 3 times China's trade with ASEAN in the year 2000. By 2022, US trade with ASEAN had grown significantly from $135 billion to $440 billion. But China's trade with ASEAN had grown from $40 billion to $975 billion. It's the world's largest trading relationship. It's bigger than the US-European Union trading relationship, right? It's an amazing. And so this idea that you can contain China is a mission impossible. Again, it reflects a lack of strategy. So, I think it's important for us, therefore, to tell Americans who visit us, please understand that the world has changed. And even if you go to Japan and South Korea, right? Again, let me ask you a simple question. Do Japan and South Korea trade more with the United States or trade more with China?
Now it's China again.
You see, so you're asking Japan and South Korea. No, of course, Japan and South Korea will go along with symbolic moves and so on and so forth, right? But a far better approach for the United States to take is to acknowledge that they cannot stop China. And the best way is to try and still integrate China. And I'm glad you used the word rules-based order at the beginning of your question. Because I think what Americans should do is go back and read a speech that Bill Clinton gave in Yale in 2003, which I also quote in Has China Won? He said, if America is going to be number one forever, then fine. America can keep on doing whatever he wants to do. It's number one forever. But Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if you can conceive of a world where America is no longer number one, then it's an American interest to strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral processes, multilateral institutions. So if the Americans really believe in a rules-based order, this is what they should be doing, strengthening multi-rules and processes. Now, again, let me ask you, which country follows multilateral rules more carefully? Is it the United States or is it China? And as a former ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I can tell you it is China that obeys multilateral rules. It is the United States of America that is strangling the World Trade Organization by blocking appointments to the appellate court. China is not blocking appointments. It is the United States that refuses to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is the United States that has withdrawn from the International Court of Justice and refuses to go back to the ICJ. So, I can go on with a long list. And actually, I think it is against American national interests to do this. So, as a friend of the United States, I say the United States should be the number one power embracing multilateral rules and norms, because at the end of the day, the United States as a society believes in the rule of law. So it should believe in the rule of law at home, and it should believe in the rule of law overseas.
Indeed. Okay, so ASEAN strategy. Is there one?
By the United States on ASEAN?
No, ASEAN with respect to dealing with these two big brothers, squabbling, and where do they end up?
Yeah. I think ASEAN is the most underrated regional organization in the whole world. It is the most underrated regional organization in the whole world because it is actually, in terms of deeds, the most successful regional organization in the whole world. Look at SAARC. It can't even meet. India and Pakistan cannot trade with each other. Look at the Gulf Cooperation Council. Saudi Arabia and UAE had sanctions on Qatar until recently. And look at European Union. It broke up before ASEAN did with Brexit. And the European Union today has the biggest war on its doorstep in Ukraine. So if you compare ASEAN against any other regional organization, it has done a better job at promoting peace and prosperity in its region. And let me ask you, within the years 2010 and 2020, did the $17 trillion European Union contribute more to global economic growth, or did the $3 trillion ASEAN economy contribute more to global economic growth? The answer is ASEAN. So, ASEAN has done remarkable things. Now, what makes it difficult to understand ASEAN is that ASEAN is inherently a weak organization. And it never has a clear long-term strategy. It always stumbles through. But guess what? It keeps stumbling through and moving forward in its own way, right? And it's actually quite amazing that, how much ASEAN has progressed, especially over the last 10 years. Again, I think in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN's economy. Now it's only 1.5 times bigger. What? So look at that. Look at how much ASEAN has progressed. So I think ASEAN has developed its own, what I call, inner genius. And right now, for example, it's trying its best to maintain good relations with the United States and maintaining good relations with China, which is the right thing to do. And again, it does it quietly without too much fanfare, but it makes sure that both sides understand clearly where they stand.
But is it possible to keep doing that? I mean, would we arrive at a point to, paint one of your, scary scenarios, Trump becomes the president and again, you're with us or you're against us type ultimatums are being given to nations around the world. How would countries in this region deal with that?
Well, I think this is precisely why the 10 ASEAN countries need to stick together. Because if they fall apart, if ASEAN breaks apart, then you'll be eaten up individually by these two great powers. So it's very important for the ASEAN countries to stay together. And so far, I can tell you that the ASEAN countries understand this very well. And they know that if they fall apart, then there'll be easy pickings for this great power. But fortunately, ASEAN has got enough heft as an organization. And ASEAN, it's 700 million people, still very significant. And ASEAN is still one of the fastest growing regions in the whole world. So there are good reasons for both United States and China to treat ASEAN with respect. I think that's what will protect ASEAN.
But what about the democratic credentials of ASEAN? I mean, it seems like, we've had a few slippages in a few of the countries in the region in recent years.
Well, at least we don't elect Donald Trump as president. I would say that any country that is going to re-elect Donald Trump after he almost mounted a coup d'etat, that's a sign that something is wrong with the democracy of that country. And that's why it's very unwise for the United States to go around preaching to other countries on how to improve their political systems. Because each ASEAN country, at the end of the day, what matters for the ASEAN countries is not the nature of the political system, but whether or not they're getting good governance, whether or not the population is improving their lives. And paradoxically, the Americans say we are for democracy, but their number one ally in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. Now, what is the difference between the political system of Vietnam and the political system of China?
I cannot think of any.
So, in vis-a-vis China, United States says we are for democracy. Vis-a-vis Vietnam, United States never says it is for democracy. So, this is where the United States has got to realize that the world has become a much more intelligent and sophisticated place. So the kind of simple black and white distinctions that are made by American policymakers, democracy versus autocracy, it just doesn't work anymore. We are moving. The 21st century is going to be very different from any other century. It's a multi-civilizational, multipolar world where you need to understand all the shades of gray, all the nuances. And if you keep coming to this world with black and white perspectives, you'll be at a severe disadvantage. I think that's also why the Asian 21st century has done so well, because what it provides is a much more nuanced view of the world than anything that is provided in the American media or Western media. So there's hunger for someone to say, hey, the old Western perspectives are not going to help us understand this world.
Speaking of multipolarity, Kishore, recently we had the Brics summit and there was a proposal to expand the Brics membership. What do you make of all this?
Well, if you had asked me 30 years ago or 20 years ago, whenever Brics was created, which club would people want to join, the G7 or Brics? And everyone, of course, we want to join the G7. It's a club of successful countries. Brics are all, poor, developing countries and so on and so forth. But guess what? We live in an amazing world where the G7 is a sunset organization. Really, its influence is going to diminish over the next 20, 30 years. And Brics has become a sunrise organization. What I find shocking So 40 countries applying to join BRICS. They must be doing something right. I mean, clearly, they're doing something right. That countries from all over the world, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, want to join BRICS. And actually, I'm amazed that BRICS has simultaneously admitted Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
Now, these countries are very deeply suspicious of each other. And if BRICS, therefore, becomes in many ways a better mirror of our world order, because in our new world order, there'll be all kinds of contradictions, and Iran, Saudi Arabia being a contradiction, but an organization that can handle contradictions is an organization that is more suited for a multipolar, multi-civilizational 21st century.
Okay, so you said that the G7 is a sunset organization, but what about the G20? I mean, it's taking place in India as we speak. There's some concerns that China may not be joining it, but isn't that a great and expanded club of large emerging market economies sitting on the same table with the big boys?
Well, I think the G20 is also a sunrise organization. I think any country invited to join the G20 will do so immediately. But at the same time, for the G20 to succeed, it's important for the United States and China to work together within the G20. Those are the two most important powers. In fact, before last year's G20 meeting in Bali, I was invited to breakfast by President Jokowi 2 days before the meeting. And I told President Jokowi, I said, if you can organize a good meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping in Bali, the world will thank you, because it will reduce tensions all around the world. And he said to me, don't worry, I've given them the nicest room in Bali for the meeting. And guess what?
It happened.
We had a very good meeting in Bali. And so that's what the G20 should be doing, bringing together not countries which agree with each other. The purpose of the G20 is to bring together countries which disagree with each other. And that will be the ultimate test of the success or failure of a G20 meeting.
Yes, speaking of countries that disagree with each other, India, China, where is this relationship going?
Sadly, the India-China relationship today is also a deeply troubled relationship. And I do worry about it a lot. Because as you know, Singapore and ASEAN, we are friends of India. And Singapore and ASEAN, we are also friends of China. And if you look back at the history of Southeast Asia over the past 2,000 years, the two countries that have had the biggest influence, or two civilizations rather, that have had the biggest influence on Southeast Asia are the Indian civilization and Chinese civilization. And paradoxically, even though China is geographically closer to Southeast Asia than India is, right? Despite that, the influence of Indic civilization is far greater on Southeast Asia. If you go to Indonesia, for example, you see scenes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata played out every day in all over Indonesia. So clearly, Southeast Asia and ASEAN have a lot to lose if relations between China and India become bad. So I think the ASEAN countries, therefore, should work harder at trying to improve ties between China and India, not to make them best friends, but just to create a new modus vivendi where they can live with each other despite the differences that they have with each other.
Finally, Kishore, a question on Singapore. We're, again, speaking in the few days after the presidential election here, and Tharman Shanmugaratnam will be the president of Singapore. We haven't really talked about Singapore in the bigger geopolitical context, whether it is the US-China relationship or ASEAN or India. So a few thoughts on where Singapore is headed.
Well, I would say the election of Tharman Shanmugaratnam as president of Singapore will be seen by future historians of Singapore 100 years from now as one of the most significant developments in Singapore's history. They will call it the BT and AT eras, the before Taman and after Taman eras. Why? The reason is that it is actually quite shocking that in an open contest between an Indian candidate and two Chinese candidates, a country with 75% Chinese population elects the Indian with an overwhelming majority of 70%. Now, that shows that Singapore has truly matured as a nation, and the Singaporean identity today is stronger than their ethnic identities. And this wasn't true when I was growing up as a child in Singapore, by the way. When I was growing up in the 1950s, there was no Singapore, right? We were a British colony. And there was no Singapore identity. There was only they only had our ethnic identities. And it's shocking that in my lifetime, we have gone from a country where our ethnic identity was first to a situation where our Singaporean identity is first. That's a huge leap forward in our national development. And at the same time, as I said in a short video calling on Singaporeans to vote for Taman, I said we're going to move into one of the most difficult geopolitical eras in human history over the next 10 years. Because as I said at the very beginning, the United States thinks it has 10 years to stop China. So the US-China contest will accelerate. Now, clearly, it's the job of the government of the day to protect Singapore geopolitically. But to have a globally respected statesman as your president creates another layer of protection. So we Singaporeans were very wise when they voted for Tharman Shanmugaratnam as their president. It shows you that Singaporeans can think long-term and realize, hey, when we go into troubled waters, let's pick the best possible man to be the president. So they understood very clearly the message that I put across in the short video. So I actually think that Singapore is going to therefore go into this new era of geopolitical contestation better equipped than it was in the past.
Well, I think that's a great optimistic point to end this conversation. Kishore Mahbubani, thank you so much for your time and insights.
My pleasure.
Thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 107 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.